This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone. I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are TNT Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hey, everybody. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Talia. Hi, everyone.
You seem like you're in a good mood.
I am in a good mood.
I am, too. Well, this one's a pisser.
Of course. They're all pissers.
They are. And you keep acting like you don't love them, but you do. I want to take 1 second and ask everybody to hit the subscribe or follow button if you haven't already. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. This one is for all of our Australian fans, and there are a lot of them. I love Australia. Let's begin. On the night of October 6th in 1974, police officer Ian Hamilton and his partner received a call from the caretakers of, I'm going to slaughter this, Yukarana Vale Youth Camp. It's a camp for kids located off of the Toowoomba Range Road in Toowoomba, Queensland, Australia. The caretakers reported that they'd been hearing the screams of a woman for about 20 to 30 minutes near the camp, but they couldn't make out where the sounds were coming from. Officer Hamilton and his partner arrived at the camp around 9 p.m. When they first got there, they didn't hear anything, but after walking about 80 meters away from the camp into the woods, they began hearing screams too. Officer Hamilton described the screams as, quote, the most terrifying and horrendous screams he'd ever heard. They were blood-curdling. Because of the strong winds, the sounds were really distorted, and no one could tell where they were coming from. The two officers walked on foot east up the range and then towards the top of the range, but they still couldn't find the source of the screaming. After about 30 to 40 minutes, they decided to get in their car and drive around the area. They stopped periodically, and when they would get out and shine their lights and try to find the origin of the screams. But by midnight, having not been able to find whoever was making those screams, they decided to head back to the station. In the following days, no one was reported missing, so eventually the screams were all but forgotten. That is until October 12th, when a woman from Brisbane reported that her niece, Lorraine Wilson, and her friend Wendy Evans had not been seen for 6 days. At the time she was reported missing, Lorraine Ruth Wilson was 20 years old. She was the youngest of 4 children. She graduated from high school and was actually training to become a nurse at a hospital in Sydney, Australia. Just prior to her disappearance, she completed her first-year nursing exams. Lorraine was friends with Wendy Joy Evans, who was 18 years old. Like Lorraine, Wendy was training to be a nurse at the same hospital, and she too had just completed her first-year nursing examinations. Lorraine was tall. She was about 5'6", 5'7". She was average build with long wavy hair. And Wendy was a lot shorter. She was 5'2", and she was a bit heavier than Lorraine. So when the two hung out, it was very distinct because of the height and the weight difference. Prior to their disappearance, the two friends decided it'd be really fun to take some time off from work and their studies and travel across Australia. They started their journey separately on August 27th, and each girl went to visit family around Australia. But they eventually reunited in Sydney, and they decided to go on a bus tour. The girls got off the bus in the city of Dubbo, which is where Lorraine's parents lived, and it was September 27th, so it was a month later. And Lorraine's parents picked them up at the bus stop. Now, the girls stayed with Lorraine's parents in Dubbo until September 30th, so for about 3 days. And on that day, Wendy and Lorraine left in Lorraine's Volkswagen Bug, and they headed to Brisbane to see Wendy's sister, Susan. However, during their drive, Lorraine's car broke down, and it had to be towed to a mechanic shop in, and I'm probably going to slaughter this, Wendy. I'm going to call it Wendy. Whatever was wrong with her car must have been a big deal because the mechanic estimated it wouldn't be fixed for at least a week, if not more. Wendy and Lorraine decided to hitchhike to Brisbane, which is a 4.5-hour drive away. So this isn't a little walk, it's a journey. They arrived at Susan's home later that night. They hung out in Brisbane for the rest of the week, and they did what most young girls do on vacation. They shopped, they ate out, and they went and had drinks at night.
My favorite things to do on vacation.
Mine too, except have drinks in the day too. Throughout the week, Lorraine kept in contact with the mechanic, just checking in to see how long it'd be before her car was done. And the mechanic couldn't give her a definitive date. The problem with that was that the ladies had to be back in Sydney to work by October 10th. Eventually got to the point where the girls had no choice. They had to head back home. Lorraine's parents offered to pick up her car in Wendy when it was done so the girls could head back to Sydney and not have to worry about it. Wendy and Lorraine told Susan that they were going to hitchhike to Dubbo, where Lorraine's parents lived. And then from there, they would catch a bus to Sydney. But they never bothered to tell anybody the route they planned on taking to get back home. Susan urged the girls to take a train or a bus instead of hitchhiking. But the girls had such a good time hitchhiking to get to Susan's house that they felt really comfortable hitchhiking back. And they wanted to save some money. So at about 11 a.m. on Sunday, October 6th, Lorraine and Wendy left Susan's house, each carrying a small suitcase and a shoulder bag. They took a bus just outside Brisbane city limits. They got off the bus and they began to hitchhike. On Saturday, October 12th, when Lorraine's mother had not heard from her, she assumed the girls decided not to stop and visit her in Dubbo, and instead she figured they must have went right home to Sydney. She called Lorraine's brother, who lived in Sydney, and asked him to check on the girls. He called the hospital where they worked, and he found out that the girls had never shown up on the 10th to report to work. He then called around all the family members to see if the girls had stopped to visit them or if any of them had heard anything. And it was Lorraine's aunt who decided to call the Chermside police and report the girls missing on October 12th. An investigation into the disappearance immediately began, and the police were able to locate the people who'd helped them when the car broke down in Wendy. They also contacted the mechanic who was fixing the Volkswagen Bug, and they were able to find the person who'd given them a lift when they'd hitchhiked from Wendy to Brisbane. There was nothing suspicious about any of these guys. They found some men that the girls hung out with in the bars in Brisbane. But again, these guys were all clear too. There were reports of the young girls being spotted all up and down the Gold Coast. But eventually years went by and the leads dried up and the sightings waned. And this case went cold with absolutely no credible leads. That is until approximately 2 years later, on June 25th of 1976, when an elderly couple was out on a date, they had decided to park their cars in the bush area near Murphy's Creek. Now, Murphy's Creek is a small town, approximately 30 kilometers or 18 miles northeast of Toowoomba. And I apologize if I'm slaughtering all of these. For some reason, this adventurous duo had driven off of the main road approximately 2.5 kilometers or 1.5 miles onto a gravel road. And then from there, they drove another 30 meters onto even a smaller track. And then from there, they drove another 400 meters onto an even smaller dirt road. And they parked their car right there in the middle of the boondocks. So what I described is the middle of nowhere. They turned on the car's headlights and they decided to go for a walk.
Was it evening?
I guess so. And I got a lot of this information from the actual court cases, and it described the couple as an elderly courting couple.
I was going to say they probably went out there to make out, but I didn't want to assume. But
that's kind of what I got from it, too. About 100 meters from a fence line near a paddock. Do you want to know what a paddock is?
Absolutely.
A paddock is a small field or enclosure where horses are kept or exercised. That's according to Google. As they were walking, they made a traumatizing discovery. They found 2 sets of human bones, along with some personal items scattered around. The skeletons were about 5 to 7 meters apart, and they could tell right away that they had stumbled upon a crime scene. I'm assuming they freaked out, and they quickly went to the police. It didn't take very long for the officers to figure out it was Wendy and Lorraine. There was a transistor radio with the name Lorraine Wilson engraved on it, right by the bodies. At the site were 2 mostly intact skeletons. However, some of the bones had been scattered by animals. Both of the skeletons had decayed jeans over the leg bones and underwear near the pelvic regions. There were also 2 fastened bra clips near the rib cage regions. Each of the bodies were found hogtied with Venetian blinds. And numerous personal effects were scattered around. There was a cigarette lighter, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, things like that.
Like things you would have packed.
Exactly. They found some other items of clothing and some jewelry. The woman's wallets, their bank book, and their checkbooks that they were known to carry with them were missing. It appeared that some of the personal items must have been grouped together and maybe fallen from a bag or a suitcase because they laid in a little area undisturbed while other parts were scattered. So an autopsy was performed on the bodies. Lorraine's body showed multiple fractures to the back of her head. The forensic pathologist estimated that Lorraine received between 1 to 3 strikes to her head with a blunt force instrument. The injuries she received would have caused almost instant death. Now, the autopsy on Wendy Evans showed she had suffered a much more severe beating than Lorraine. Wendy had extensive injuries to her facial area. The top of her head and the sides of her head were all fractured. This had to have been caused by a large number of severe blows. The medical examiner said, quote, her face would have been literally bashed to a pulp, and then she would have suffered many more blows than would have been sufficient to kill her.
Oh.
The area the bodies were found was so desolate that the nearest house was over a kilometer or 0.62 miles away. However, the police did interview the people that lived nearby, and one man remembered that on November 1st in 1974, now this is 2 years earlier, and a few weeks after the girls went missing, he had went to the same area where the bodies were. He was looking for 3 of his cattle, which had escaped. He smelled the strong odor, which made him think that one of the cows had died. He tried to find the source of the smell, but he couldn't. In retrospect, he had came within 50 meters of the girls' bodies, but he didn't see anything and he left the area. For the next 40 years, Tanya, there would be an investigation into the girls' disappearances. It culminated into a coroner's inquest that began in the winter of 2012 and the early spring of 2013. For those who don't know what a coroner's inquest is, according to the Office of the Queensland Coroner's website, an inquest is a court hearing in which the state coroner gathers information to assist in determining the cause and circumstances of death, and to make recommendations which may prevent similar deaths from occurring in the future. So basically, it's a formal investigation into the death of someone, which results in a report, and the report can result in an arrest.
This didn't happen for 40 years?
For 40 years. I used the 2013 coroner's findings of fact to get a majority of the information for this story. It's 37 pages long. There was also a book I read that was written by Lorraine's brother. His name is Eric Wilson, and it's called The Ricochet of Echoes. Now, as I stated, the coroner's findings of inquest reach a conclusion. And in the book, The Ricochet of Echoes, Eric Wilson reaches a different conclusion. They're kind of the same, but there's some variables. So when I talk about the story, I'm using Eric Wilson's version because I truly think that he is more liberal in going ahead and writing what he really thinks happened than the findings of inquest does. I think they're a little more conservative in what they have to say. So what I'm going to describe to you in the next half hour is what actually took 40 years to gather. And this is the stuff that nightmares are made of. Sincerely, this is horrifying.
Hey everyone, if you go to our website, tntcrimes.com, you can find full unreleased episodes available for individual purchase. You can also join our membership where you get unlimited access to all of our unreleased episodes and early releases, mini episodes, and so many other awesome things. So go to tntcrimes.com, and thanks again for all your support.
Okay, so we're back. The first witness I'm going to talk about is a bus driver. He approached the police to report his suspicions that he may have seen the missing women in the city of Oxley, which is a 20-minute drive southwest of Brisbane. He saw the women standing on the side of the road with some luggage. In the short time he saw them, he saw a 1963 green Holden sedan pull up alongside the girls, and he watched them willfully hop into the back seat. The car was driven by a young man who appeared to be 20 years old, and there was another man around the same age as him in the car. And as I said, Oxley is just outside of Brisbane's city limits, so they must have been picked up really quick when they started hitchhiking. Hours later, a man named Peter bumped into an acquaintance of his named Carrie Thompson. I'm going to throw so many names out that honestly, it really doesn't matter. They're just evil men. But some of them are still alive and they should be shamed, so I'm going to throw their names out. But don't worry if you can't keep up with the names. Peter bumps into this acquaintance, Carrie Thompson, at the Shell service station in downtown Toowoomba. He grew up with Carrie, so he knew him really well, and the two began conversing. Carrie told him he was testing out the green Holden to see if he wanted to buy it. Carrie also told Peter that he'd picked up two hitchhikers, and he planned on taking them to a party and showing them around Toowoomba. Then the witness saw Lorraine get out of the passenger side of the car, and she went to use the bathroom in the gas station. Wendy was in the back seat, sitting next to a man named Gordy Laurie, and both girls seemed just fine to Peter. Peter said Carrie laughed and said he hoped he broke his leg that day because the hitchhikers were two nurses, and he kind of gave him a little smirk. After using the bathroom, Lorraine walked out, and she also had some drinks in her hand that she'd purchased. The next sighting of the girls is by a couple named Brian and Velma Britcher. They reported to the police that on October 6th, they were driving down the Toowoomba Range on their trip home from visiting their sick baby in the hospital. Apparently, the drive down is very steep, so Brian put the car in second gear and he drove really slow. When he came around a bend, he saw this green Holden on the side of the road with the doors open. Brian and Velma saw a woman who looked like Wendy in the back of the car, and she was struggling with a man, and this man was trying to place his arm around her neck. Wendy looked at Brian and Velma and yelled out, "Help me." Brian slowed down almost to a stop, and he rolled his window down. He was about 20 yards away from the parked car when he noticed a taller woman, who was later identified as Lorraine, with her hands behind her head. She was being marched back up the range and forced into a car. She looked at Brian and Velma and she yelled out, "Oh God, please help me." Then Brian and Velma saw 3 other men, if not more, on the side of the road. The Pritchards were too afraid to help because they had a 3-year-old child in their car, and they drove off.
Oh. And they didn't call the police or anything?
They did not have a phone at their house, so they waited until the next day to go to the police.
Oh my God.
When they did go to their local police department, it wasn't close to Toowoomba, and the police officer said no one's missing, and he kind of dismissed the Pritchards' complaint.
Like, oh, never mind.
Then another couple named Neil and Jocelyn Beadle reported to the police what they witnessed down the Toowoomba Range Road in 1974. They've been driving with their children in the car, and they drove this route a lot. And they knew that their kids eventually got car sick, so they would always pull over to the spot on the side of the road so the kids could just get out and, take a second. Because car sickness sucks.
Take a breather. I know my daughter had it bad when she was little.
And they're winding roads.
Oh.
When Neil went to pull over to the spot that they always parked, he couldn't because there were 2 cars parked there. He noticed clothes thrown all over the front of one of the cars, and there was also some clothes on the side of the road. Neil and Jocelyn then saw a man forcefully holding a young woman's arms, trying to get her into the car. Another man ran over to help him while the girl was yelling out to the Beatles, "Please help me, please help me." Then they noticed another young woman struggling with a man in the back seat of the second car, and this woman yelled out to the Beatles, "Help me, please help me." As they drove away from the scene, they counted a total of 6 men and 2 women on the side of the road. According to Neil and Jocelyn Beadle, they went to the nearest police department, but it was about 30 minutes away, and they said it was closed.
The police was closed?
You will see there's a lot of excuses as to why people didn't report things.
Do the police ever close, though? Seriously?
This is the 70s and it's Australia. I don't know much about Australian police in the 70s.
I don't either, but I find that incredibly shocking.
And I have described the Boone fucking Docks to you, Tanya.
Yeah, that's true.
Neil and Jocelyn later said that they convinced themselves this wasn't as serious as they thought. And eventually they got it in their head. It was just a squabble. And they together minimized the incident. They actually didn't have a formal sit down with the police until 2005. You are going to be very pissed off by the time this is done. I told you this is a pisser. This is one of our high pissers. We need a pisser.
Pisser meter?
Pisser meter.
I just can't believe none of these people helped.
So the next witness I want to talk about, his name is Melvin Oliver. And on October 6th, he was a farm machinery salesman for a Toowoomba firm. Late in the day, as he was driving down the Toowoomba Range, he saw a car parked off to the left-hand side of the road. He too slowed down to almost a stop, and when he did, he could see a young woman he later identified as Wendy. She was sitting on the ground with her hands tied behind her back and her head down. Lorraine was standing up as a man was tying her hands together. Melvin Oliver estimates that he was parked there for at least a couple minutes before he realized there were more men in the back of the car. He got really nervous and he drove off. As he went around another curve, he spotted a second car parked, and that one he described as a green Holden. Inside that one, he saw at least 3 men. Now Melvin Oliver is freaked out, and he immediately speeds off, and the green Holden starts chasing him. The men in the vehicle order him to pull over, and he was like, oh, hell, no.
Yeah, no thanks.
Then the driver tried to push Melvin's car off the road, but he wasn't successful.
Oh, my God.
Eventually, once Melvin got to town, he was able to lose the men. He didn't report this to the police. And do you want to know why he didn't report this to the police?
Because he was scared?
Oh, no. That would make sense. This is what he said in 1989. He said that in the area at the time, there'd been a bunch of students that were pretending to be robbers and doing staged holdups around town. And he thought that it was just a bunch of students doing a prank.
Stop it.
And so that's why he just let it go.
Then why was he scared if it was just a prank?
I don't know, sounds like a bullshit excuse to me.
Mm-hmm.
He said if the girls had really been in trouble, then because he was parked staring at them, they should have said something to him.
Well, they've already told 600 other people and nobody did shit, so...
Yeah, right? Maybe they thought the fact that they were being tied up would be a hint that they needed some help. Anyway, that is Melvin Oliver's story.
Shame on you, Melvin.
It's bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Let's admit, he was a wuss. Mm-hmm. He was scared, and I don't blame him.
I don't blame him. It probably would have scared the shit out of me, too.
But just say I was scared. Don't say, oh, I thought they were actors. Just those silly students pretending to tie women up on the side of the road. The next 2 witnesses that I want to talk about are Mr. Vivian Murphy and his wife, Rose.
Are you shitting me? There's more people.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Wow. More people. This is crazy, Talia.
It is really, it's very upsetting. It's so ridiculous. Vivian and Rose Murphy frequently traveled down the Toowoomba Range Road with their 3 children to visit Rose's mother. On October 6th, it was just about dark, so they put their lights on, and as they went around a curve, they saw 2 cars pulled over to the side of the road and what looked like a man and a woman cuddling. Then a young woman ran out from the side towards the road, and a man was chasing after her. As the Murphys slowed down to pass by, the woman reached out her hands, and this is probably Lorraine, and cried out, quote, "Help, help." Rose Murphy described the young woman as being so frightened and that the man, quote, he was going to get her. He didn't care that we'd seen him or anyone else because he didn't slow down chasing her, end quote. You know what Rose told her husband to do? Keep going, don't stop. So they drove away.
Damn.
They went to, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Helidon, and that's where the nearest police station was to report the incident. So I have to give them credit. They did go to report the incident. For them, apparently the police department was open. The officer on duty said he couldn't leave his station because he was the only person working there, but he would let the Toowoomba police know. As far as anyone knows, and according to the records, the police didn't do anything about it. Rose, in her defense, did reach out to the police throughout the years and tried to tell them her and her husband's story of what they saw, but the police didn't formally interview her and Vivian until 2005.
Man, don't get caught out in the boonies in Australia. The police aren't going to do anything.
And in reading about this case, there is some shame from the Queensland police and the investigators. This is a stain on their record. I am sure they are an outstanding group of people, and the people that were investigating this in 1974 are not the same people that did the 2012-2013 case. So we're not trying to shit on any of them.
No, maybe just a little. The one in 1974.
Just a little.
Just a little.
Another witness, because I'm still going through the witnesses.
Lord.
Another witness who came forward to provide information was Robert Styler. He said on the night of Wendy and Lorraine's abduction, he was heading down the Toowoomba Range on his way home, and it was about 8 p.m. As he came around a bend, he spotted a green Holden on the side of the road. He saw a man struggling with a woman in the back seat, and he knew who the man was. His name was Wayne Boogie, quote-unquote, Hilton. And the woman was later identified as Wendy. As Robert slowed down, he came upon another vehicle with a man that he couldn't identify, and this man was struggling with Lorraine. Now, Robert kept going. He didn't stop because he knew Boogie, and Boogie was a very dangerous man, and Robert was deathly afraid of him. So afraid that he waited until 1999 to report what he saw to the police.
Wow, so he didn't even stop at the police at the time.
Nope. The next witness we're going to talk about, his name is Peter Trelka. He and some friends were headed down the Toowoomba Range Road around dusk on October 6th when he came upon two cars pulled over to the side of the road, and one was a green Holden. He saw the two young women separate from each other by a few meters, and he could tell they were clearly in distress because they were struggling and they were trying to run away from at least 4 men. Peter Trelka, like Robert, recognized the men as being local guys. Boogie Hilton, Ungie Laurie, Shorty Laurie, and some other degenerates. Peter went to school with Boogie, and he knew Boogie was a bad dude. Peter and his friends decided not to intervene to help the girls because, quote, there were carloads of them and only 3 of us. Peter and his friends were so afraid of the men that they didn't come forward to report this until 1989.
Boogie must be some sort of horrible, horrible dude.
As upsetting as these witness accounts are, the next one I'm going to tell you is hands down the most disturbing sighting of the girls. And this is from a witness named Norma Sperling. Norma lived in Toowoomba in 1974, and in the late afternoon, she says, or early evening, while she was in her house preparing dinner, a young woman came to her back door yelling out, "Is anyone home?" Norma, thinking it was her neighbor, told the woman to come on in. When Norma turned around, in her laundry room stood Lorraine. Lorraine asked Norma if she could stay at Norma's house because she was trying to get away from some people. She said there'd been a party and she had a disagreement with someone. Now, this is all according to Norma, okay? Norma says she asked Lorraine if she was in trouble and needed the police, but Lorraine said no.
Really?
Which, of course, would explain and excuse Norma from not calling the police.
Absolutely.
Then Norma told Lorraine that she couldn't stay at her house. And Norma claims Lorraine said, quote, "They would probably find me anyway." Then the two women just stared at each other in awkward silence. And apparently Lorraine said, quote, "I better go," and left.
I smell some bullshit.
Norma says she went back to peeling her potatoes, and then she heard a scream. She peeked out her front window, and she saw there was a car parked on the street, and, quote, this chappie was struggling with a girl, trying to get her into the back of the car. He was really struggling with her and hitting her across the face. End quote. She recognized the girl as Lorraine. Norma said there was another man and woman in the car struggling, and the other woman was screaming too. As Norma is seeing all this, her husband drives past the cars and goes into their driveway. Norma told her husband about what was happening, and he told her it was just a case of domestic squabbling and that they, quote, need not get involved, which they didn't until 1989.
What the hell?
I don't even know what to say.
I'm shocked. I'm really sad that all these people saw these girls.
I don't even know how many that witnesses. I didn't count.
I counted like 12 now.
And I am almost certain that Norma has rewrote history to make herself not look quite so bad.
I would agree with you because I doubt somebody in trouble would be like, oh, they're just going to get me anyway and just leave. I'd be begging to stay there, right?
I wouldn't leave.
Right?
Would not leave.
No, you're going to have to drag me out. You're going to have to call the police. I don't know.
Throughout the investigation, a phone tip came in from an anonymous caller who told the police that two brothers named Boogie Hilton and Desi Hilton were known around the area of Toowoomba for picking up schoolgirls and raping them. Desi and Boogie had a group of friends that would join them for their gangbangs. Most of the friends in their group were part of the Lawry's family. And again, I could be pronouncing it wrong. At this point in this episode, I don't care. And many of the Lawry family members were either married to or had dated the Hilton family members. There was Ian, Gordy, Shorty, Youngie, all these Lorrys. And they had a friend named Jimmy, Charles, and Larry. Then there were the Hiltons, and I'm just going to say some of them. Desi, Boogie, Trevor, Stanley, Walter. So basically, there were two hillbilly troublemaking families in Toowoomba, and they described themselves as, quote, being full of piss and bad manners. The Hilton and the Lorrys hung around together with their scary friends, Larry, Jimmy, and Charles Kingsley. And this group of thugs, they were known for using violence and fear to terrorize the people of Toowoomba. As a result, they were able to repeatedly get away with beatings, which they referred to as hidings. I've never heard it called hidings.
Me either.
Well, I Googled hidings and it means beating.
Huh.
Must be an Australian thing. And they got away with the rapes of young women with no repercussions. Ever. Here are just a few of their unpunished crimes. In 1979, a 19-year-old named Anne accepted a ride from Shorty Lorry and his friend. Instead of taking her home, they drove her to an open ground area behind a college. They stopped the car. The other man got in the back seat, and Shorty locked the doors. Then they both raped her and dropped her off across the street from her house. She told her dad, and he did report it to the police. A rape kit was done on her at the hospital, and the police confiscated her clothes. But she never heard back from the police, ever. However, she did hear from other people that the same thing had been happening to many young women, and she became too afraid to follow up with the police herself. Then there's another girl named Gail. She was 16 in 1969 when she met Ian, Gordon, and Shorty Lorry. They were all really nice to her and offered her a ride home. When she got into the car, she noticed there were no door handles or window handles. She asked them why, and they said they were fixing the door. But as a result, she couldn't get out of the car. They gave her some beer, and once they thought she was drunk, they forced her pants off. Then they poured beer on what they would call their old fella, their dicks, and they took turns raping her. They raped her so many times that she lost count. Another victim of this vicious group was 15-year-old Carrie Ann. Carrie Ann ran away in 1974, and while she was in Wendy, she got a ride from Shorty. He drove her to an isolated area and he raped her multiple times. It's kind of messed up, but inadvertently, she ended up staying with some men from the Hilton clan. And of course, the Hiltons were friends with Shorty. According to Carrie Ann, a gang of men comprised of the Hiltons and the Lauries and their friends would drive around Toowoomba and Goondiwindi looking for women that they could have sex with willingly or forcefully. They often had these overnight parties around campfires in a riverbed. Carrie Ann claimed that on numerous occasions she was gang raped by the men, and they would brutally hit her with whatever they could find around. Why she didn't leave, I don't know. I don't know her full story. But some of the gangbang parties had been at Murphy's Creek, where Lorraine and Wendy's bodies were found. Carrie Ann was actually in the car one time when the men kidnapped a young blonde girl that Carrie said had ringlets in her hair and looked to be about 14. The men just grabbed her off the street and they threw her in the trunk and they gang raped her. Those are just a few examples of what the Toowoomba gang would do. And it wasn't a secret to the townspeople or the police. Everyone was just too afraid to intervene. And a little interesting side note, a man came forward to report what he thought was the abduction of Wendy and Lorraine years later. But what he witnessed was most likely the abduction and rape of some other girls.
Are you kidding me?
He saw these two girls on the side of the road, but he saw them on the other side of the Toowoomba Range. And they were sitting on the side of the road, tied up. There were 4 or 5 men surrounding the car. One of the women was crying. He said the situation didn't feel right. And so he slowed down and he asked the girls if they were okay. And one of the girls just mumbled something that led him to believe they were fine. And so he just moved on. But again, that incident was on the other side of the range and he couldn't give an exact date. There were so many people that testified at the inquest in 2012 and 2013. So what I'm going to try to do is summarize what I believe happened on the night of October 6, 1974, based on the findings of the inquest and the ricochet of echoes. Lorraine and Wendy weren't hitchhiking long when they accepted a ride from Carrie Thompson and Gordy Laurie. Lorraine and Wendy hung out with these guys and they partied for a while willingly. At some point, Charles Kingsley joined them, and he's a bad dude. The girls and the men went over to the Laurie clan's house and they partied with Ungie and Shorty and some of the Hiltons. The girls left the house with Boogie and Donnie Hilton in the green Holden. There were actually 2 other vehicles that followed behind. They actually went to Murphy's Creek to party. And as I said, that's a really desolate area. At the party in the beginning, there were about 10 men, and they were drinking with the 2 women. Now, Shorty has a 10-year-old brother, Walter, who's also the nephew of Donnie and Ungie. He says that at some point, his mom and dad took him to the party. Because that's what a 10-year-old should be doing, is going to a gangbang. His mom stayed in the car while his dad and some more of his uncles got out. They had to crawl through a barbed wire fence to get to the clearing in the paddock where the party was. And Walter went with them. He saw a bonfire going, and Walter actually just sat on a log by it and just observed things. He saw Shorty and Larry Charles raping Lorraine and Wendy. One of the women had only a shirt on, and the other woman was completely naked. When the 2 men were finished, 2 men named Jimmy and Donnie asked to screw the girls next. When the girls resisted, Boogie punched one of them and said, "There you go, Jimmy, you can have your turn." At some point, Lorraine escaped into the woods and went screaming, which is when the camp probably called the police. Shorty and Boogie chased after her, and the other guys grabbed Wendy and they put her in the car, and they all took off looking for Lorraine. It took them a while to catch her. It was actually described as hours to catch her, and she had probably gone to Norma's house. When they finally caught her, they beat her in the car. Then they drove the girls back to Murphy's Creek and continued where they left off. More men showed up in a car, and all of the men took turns raping and beating the women throughout the night. Those girls were gangbanged by at least 10 men.
Oh my God.
For hours. Just humiliated. When morning broke, some of the men left, but Jimmy, Donnie, Ungie, Shorty, and Larry stayed behind. Lorraine and Wendy were hogtied and laying on the ground with their heads down. And there's some discrepancy as to what happened, so you know. One of the men claims that they were hogtied and then tied to a tree, and they were actually left there for a couple days, and that he wanted to give them some water because he started feeling really bad, and they told him if he did, he would be murdered. We know at some point, Shorty and Boogie grabbed some logs and hit Lorraine and Wendy over the head.
Ooh.
For some reason, they were more aggressive with Wendy, and they all took turns stomping on her face and head until it was completely smashed in to a pulp. As the men were driving away, Boogie noticed Lorraine moving and got back out of the car and hit her over the head again. The men took off, and later they each took turns cutting their thumbs with a knife. And this is so goddamn stupid, Tanya. I can't believe I have to tell you this. They put their thumbs together and said, now we're blood brothers. So if anyone talks about this, the other four have a right to kill him.
That's like something 8-year-olds do.
It's the stupidest thing. I'm sure these guys were not the most intellectual men out there. Later that morning, the men brought the car to their friend Desi's house and asked him to clean the blood off from the back seat because it was smeared there. Desi described it as if someone had been bleeding and dragged across the seat. They told Desi that they'd given the girls a good hiding down at the bottom of the range. Throughout the years, some of these guys confessed and they would cry, I didn't want the nurses to die. They were all drunks, too. Larry confessed his part of the crime to a minister in the hope of getting some sort of redemption. I love this minister. He told Larry, go confess to the police and then you can come back and talk to me. Larry didn't. Larry then confessed to another friend about the murder, and he also admitted to 4 other rapes that he had participated in with the Lauries and the Hiltons. And he asked his friend what he should do. And his friend told him the only way you'll ever be clear is when you're dead. So the next day, Larry committed suicide with a gun. Now, Donnie made a deathbed confession saying that he was there when Shorty and Boogie killed the nurses, but he was too afraid to go to the police to report it.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. He's the one that claims the girls were tied to a tree for 2 or 3 days.
And that he wanted to give them water.
Yeah, he's so generous.
Yes.
Kerry Thompson, he was the one originally spotted with them in Toowoomba. He died in a car crash. Wayne Boogie Hilton, he died in a car crash in 1986. Most of the men that participated in the crime died. There are only 3 remaining alive. They testified at the inquest, and they all claimed to be innocent.
Well, of course.
The results of the inquest concluded that if Boogie Hilton was still alive today, there would be enough evidence to try him for the murders of the women. It also concluded that they know he didn't act alone, but there just wasn't enough evidence to try anybody else for the rapes and murders of Lorraine and Wendy.
How unsatisfying.
Yeah, there's still 3 people out there that are alive.
Who probably participated, allegedly. Maybe.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
Everybody knows they did. That is the story of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans.
Oh, what an awful story.
It's a pisser.
Definitely. Well, thanks for that, Talia, I think.
You're welcome, I think.
Oh, I hate when people aren't punished.
Yeah, let me just tell you, side note, none of them went off to live a good life. They have, some of them have dementia from alcoholism. They're all in rough shape.
Still rather unsatisfying.
It is. And to me, just the witnesses, I mean...
I always put myself in the place of witnesses or whatever. I always try to think, what would I do? Would I have called the police?
Well, you don't have a phone on you.
I mean, was it so disturbing to them? I would think I would go to the police.
I don't see any harm in going to the police anonymously.
True.
I'm sure that they all feel very guilty. But I can see not getting out of the car. I would be scared shitless.
I can see not getting out of the car, especially if you have kids with you or like those couple people were alone. I understand not getting out of the car at all. I mean, for sure, I'm with you on that one.
So that is the story. I want to thank everybody for listening. Next week, Tanya's going to have an amazing story. And we have some shout-outs.
We do. We have shout-outs for Amy C.
Thank you, Amy.
James D.
Thank you, James D.
Amy B.
Thank you, Amy B.
Sam W.
Sam W.
Vicky O.
And Vicky O. Everybody should give a round of applause for all of them because their support helps us be able to give this all to the rest of you.
Woohoo!
So if you want to become a member like they have, you can go to patreon.com/TNT Crimes and you can get all of our exclusive member-only episodes, or you can buy them on our website at tntcrimes.com. Where else can they find us, Tanya?
You can find us on social media, on Instagram and Facebook at TNT Crimes. Also on Twitter. All right, Talia. Well, until next week, everyone.
Hit the subscribe button and thank you for listening. We love you.
Bye. Bye.